Unbelievably cool animals that once roamed the earth, but have since met their demise. From golden frogs to flying elephants, here are the top 15 most awesome extinct animals. Number 15. Spix macaw. The Spix macaw, also commonly known as the little blue macaw, was a species that was native to the jungle regions of Brazil. Weighing up to 11 ounces and growing to just 22 inches long, it was one of the smaller species of macaw that, as the name would suggest, was covered in plumage that was of various shades of blue. They were once a common sight in the trees of the region, but even by the time the first specimen was captured in 1819, it's thought population numbers were in decline due to habitat destruction because of burning and logging, and the last time one was seen in the wild was in 2016. As a result, the species is now regarded as being extinct in the wild, and while several individuals still exist in captivity, with plans to one day hopefully reintroduce them into their natural environment, for now, the only place you can see one is a zoo. Number 14. Pinta Island Tortoise. The Pinta Island tortoise was a large species that was native to the Galapagos Islands, but after their first discovery in the 19th century, they became a popular target for hunters, and their numbers dwindled to such an extent that they're now classified as being extinct. The last individual, a male called Lonesome George, was found in 1971, but after his death in 2012, no further ones have been seen. They were a majestic species, growing to a size of between 5 and 6 feet long and weighing up to 400 pounds. They had a dark brownish-gray shell, long necks, and toothless mouths that had adapted for their herbivorous diet, and usually lived in the drier lowland regions of the island. Thought to live for as long as 150 years, they were able to store water in their bladders, which meant they could survive for up to 18 months without having to drink. They became an important food source for seafarers passing by the Galapagos Islands, but the introduction of a large population of goats to Pinta Island also accelerated their demise. By eating large swaths of vegetation, the tortoises were left without a food source, so those that weren't captured by the visitors went on to die from starvation. While this species in particular is now thought to be gone, there are several other closely related giant species of tortoise in the Galapagos, and conservation efforts have been increased with them to hopefully ensure they aren't all lost in the same way. Number 13. Chinese paddlefish. The Chinese paddlefish, also often referred to as a swordfish, was a species of river fish that used to be found in the Yangtze and Yellow River basins. Growing up to 10 feet long, they were one of the largest known species of mainly freshwater fish, but they also spent part of their lives at sea, returning to rivers to breed. They mainly fed on other fish species, and it was this, as well as being a popular fish to be hunted, which ultimately led to their decline. There were traditions around paddlefish hunting that stretched back centuries, and by the 1970s, more than 25 tons worth of the fish were being captured every year. The last one seen in the wild was captured in 2003, however, and they are believed to have gone extinct soon after. A combination of hunting and reduced amount of prey for them to catch, and the changing of their environment, particularly the construction of dams that prevented them from following their migratory routes, is thought to be to blame. Number 12. The Sumatran Rhino. As one of just 5 species of rhinoceros that remained until very recently, the Sumatran rhino was the smallest of all of them, but in comparison to other mammals, it was still huge, measuring up to 10.4 feet long, almost 5 feet tall to the shoulder, and weighing up to a ton. Like other species, they had 2 horns, the first called a nasal horn, which would grow up to 10 inches long, and the second, which was a little more than a stub. They were known for their unusual color, and instead of the grayish color you normally think of with a rhino, had a coating of reddish-brown hairs. The solitary animals were once prevalent across swampy regions of India, Myanmar, Laos, Indonesia, and Malaysia, and have never been able to recover from being hunted so much. In fact, the first one that was documented in 1793 was shot on sight, and since then their numbers have been in rapid decline. The last ones are thought to have died out in 2019, which makes this one of the most recent species to have become extinct because of human activity. Number 11. Algos foliage gleaner. The Algos foliage gleaner was a species of bird that was native to Brazil, where they lived high up in the tree canopies of the rainforest, surviving on a diet of bugs and foliage. They grew to around 7 inches long and weighed around 1.5 ounces, and were known for their unique nests that they would make out of clay, which led to them being known as oven birds. The brown birds were only first recorded in 1979, and while a new colony was discovered in the Brazilian state of Pernambuco in 2003, the last sighting in the wild was in 2011. Like most birds, they were so reliant on a healthy forest ecosystem to survive that their habitat's destruction by the logging industry is believed to be the main reason why their numbers plummeted. and why, as of 2019, they're now considered to be extinct. With so few places left that are suited to them, it's thought highly unlikely that there are any populations left in the wild that are undiscovered. Number 10. Golden Toad. The golden toad was a species of toad that was native to a very small 1.5 square mile region of the elfin cloud forest in Costa Rica. And while they once existed in large numbers, there hasn't been a single sighting of one since 1989, so they're now considered to be extinct. Growing to a little more than 2 inches in length, the males were a vivid, bold orange color in order to attract females, who were instead darker shades of charcoal with yellow patches. They spent most of their lives in burrows dug within the moist soil and are thought to have lived for up to 12 years. Surveys conducted when they were first discovered in the 1960s suggested there could have been as many as 1,500 individuals in the small region, and there are various theories about why they died out. The habitat hasn't been majorly impacted by human activity like elsewhere, but it's thought that climate events such as the El Niño weather system in 1986 through 87, which caused the lowest rainfall and highest temperatures ever recorded in Costa Rica, along with chytrid fungus, which has been responsible for decimating amphibian species around the world, are the main causes. Number 9. Steller's sea cow. The Steller's sea cow, named after the man who first documented seeing one on a voyage in 1741, was a species closely related to the dugong, but were much larger, in some cases growing up to 30 feet long and weighing up to 11 tons. Thought to have been around for tens of thousands of years, they were mainly found in the freezing waters of the Bering Sea between Alaska and Russia. And part of the reason they grew so large was to accommodate a thick layer of blubber that allowed them to survive in those conditions. They had no teeth and instead had a layer of bristles and plates in their mouths, which they used to crush plankton with, and would communicate with one another by a series of snorts and grunts. After the first voyage through the area that found them, Steller's sea cows were hunted to the brink of extinction within a very short period of time. It was a route used by fur traders and seal hunters, and they'd capture huge animals for food and to collect their blubber. It was thought that when Steller first saw one, there may have been as few as 1,500 individuals in the wild, and they were tragically wiped out within 27 years. We are constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button. Number 8. Two-Lake Wallaby. Australia is known for its animals that evolve separately from the rest of the world and has a long history of species seen nowhere else. One of the most incredible, though, was the Two-Lake Wallaby, which was first described in 1846. Also known as the monkey face or 1-2 wallaby because of their facial colorations, they had altering bands of lighter and darker fur along their backs, which were believed to change across the seasons. They had a notable means of movement similar to that of a kangaroo and would do 2 short hops before a long hop, and according to reports, would then stop for a moment to take in their surroundings before starting again. While the species had survived for thousands of years before European colonists arrived into Australia, they only managed to last a further 85 years once people began hunting them for their fur. Despite conservation efforts in the 1920s, by that time the damage had already been done, and the last sighting in the wild was in 1924. They proved to be particularly difficult to breed in captivity, so the last two-lake wallaby on Earth died in 1939. Number 7. Jamaican Giant Gallowisp. The Jamaican Giant Gallowisp was an incredible species of lizard that was native to the Caribbean country, and were closely related to other gallowisp that can be found across the region and South America. They were once a common sight along riverbanks and in the jungle regions, but as more settlers made the island their home, conditions began to rapidly change. It was the introduction of non-native animals that spelled disaster for this gallowisp species, though, in particular mongooses, that began to be introduced into the island to combat the rapidly increasing rat populations and to control the number of snakes on sugar plantations. The consequence, however, was that they also hunted the giant gallowisp, and none have been seen since the 19th century. Now classed as extinct, there are still hopes that a small community may have survived in an inaccessible area in the lower morass of the Black River, but despite several attempts to find them, efforts have been in vain. Number 6. Tasmanian Tiger. Thanks to the cartoon, Tasmania is known as a place that's home to all sorts of peculiar creatures. But rather than being purely made up, there is historical evidence that it was once home to a particularly unusual creature, known as the thylacine, or more commonly, the Tasmanian tiger. It was actually a large species of carnivorous marsupial that first evolved around 4 million years ago, and was also found in parts of Australia and New Guinea. By the time Europeans arrived in Australia, they had already become extinct there. Only a small population remained in Tasmania. Growing to around 80 inches long, including their tails, they had a series of distinctive black stripes along the rear part of their body, and were often said to look like two halves of different animals that had been sewn together. Unfortunately, as people started to set up communities on Tasmania, the thylacines were blamed for a series of attacks on livestock, and bounties were offered to anyone who killed them. This soon saw a fatal collapse in their numbers, and by the 1930s, they were extinct. Number 5. Elephant bird. The aptly named elephant bird, which was native to Madagascar, was the world's largest species of bird until they went extinct several hundred years ago. Surprisingly, their closest known relatives were the kiwi birds of New Zealand, which suggests they descend from a lineage with its roots back when the Earth's land masses were a giant supercontinent. But these ones developed in an entirely different way to their cousins on the other side of the globe. Growing to an astonishing 9.8 feet tall and weighing up to 4/5 of a ton, their size meant they soon gained a reputation for their ferocity, whether justified or not, and they were said to be strong enough to carry a baby elephant in their talons. Marco Polo once wrote about the birds on his travels, and it's possible the species continued to exist well into the 18th or 19th centuries. But because of habitat changes and hunting for their meat, they have now long died out and are yet another species that has become extinct because of human activity. Number 4. Short-Faced Kangaroo. Today, while there are several different types of kangaroo, they all look fairly similar to one another. This hasn't always been the way, and the animals used to have far more variety. One of the cutest and most surprising was the short-faced kangaroo, which lived in Australia over 10,000 years ago. The largest ones grew up to 9 feet tall and weighed as much as 530 pounds, but there was a significant variation in them too, and the smallest were just a third of that size. They lived in the drier regions of the country and were perfectly adapted to these harsh conditions. Much larger than contemporary kangaroos, which they lived alongside, their flat faces mean they could reach further into trees to eat the leaves. Their feet were also strange, with just a single claw on each that helped them move quickly across dry soil. And on their front paws, 2 of their fingers were extra long with claws on them, which likely helped them to hold onto branches so they could pull them close in to eat. Number 3. Quagga. Native to South Africa, the quagga was a closely related species to zebras, and they were named after the sounds they made when calling out for each other. Growing to around 8.5 feet long, they were noticeable among other species of zebra by the fact that the striped patterning was only present on the front half of their bodies, with a solid color to the rear. The shape of the patterns varied significantly between individuals, and while little is actually known about their behavior, they're thought to have existed in huge numbers, particularly in the Cape Province, and would gather in herds of between 50 and 100. When Dutch settlers arrived, however, the quagga was extensively hunted because they competed with imported livestock for the same food. The species became extinct in the wild in 1878, and the last one in captivity died just 5 years later, and there's only one known image of one in existence. All may not be lost, however. The quagga was the first extinct animal to have its DNA fully sequenced, and because they were so closely related to zebras, it's hoped that it may one day be possible to breed some more. Number 2. Delcorts giant gecko. Geckos are some of the strangest types of lizard on Earth, with the ability to walk across virtually any surface at any angle. But the largest known type of gecko to have ever existed was the Delcorts giant gecko, a species that is now considered to be long extinct. They're thought to have been native to New Zealand, where they're often mentioned in Maori culture and known as kauaiau, although some historians dispute whether these were actually the same animals or not. Growing up to 24 inches long, including their tails, they were a huge species, but the only documentation of someone seeing one alive comes from a Maori chief in 1870, who found one under a dead tree and killed it. Said to be as thick as a man's wrist and brownish with red stripes, a stuffed specimen was found in the basement of the Natural History Museum in Marseille, France, in 1986. But there are no records as to where it had come from or when. They are therefore somewhat of a mystery, even though we know they definitely did exist. And there are some that believe they came from a completely different island, and it's quite possible that there's still a living colony somewhere in the world. Number 1. Camelops. If you were asked where in the world camels originated, the answer you'd most likely give would be either Asia or Africa. But surprisingly, they actually first evolved in North America around 44 million years ago, before migrating across a land bridge to Eurasia at a later time. There have been quite a few different species throughout history, in all shapes and sizes, but the most impressive has to be the Camelops, which was a giant camel that first emerged around 4 million years ago. and only ever lived in what is the modern-day US. It's not known whether they had humps like their modern-day relatives, because soft tissue doesn't preserve as fossils, but from their skeletons it's possible to deduce that they would have been around 7 feet and 3 inches tall to the shoulder and weighed just under a ton. Their extinction around 10,000 years ago is linked to the movement of human communities across the continent, and some remains have been found with evidence of human tools nearby. It's quite possible, therefore, that the Camelops could have been one of the first species to be hunted to extinction by humans. But some argue there were other factors involved, such as the changing climate in the tail end of the last ice age and increasing competition for food from other newly evolved species. Subscribe to Top 5s for more and check out some of our other popular videos.